Welcome back to another deep dive. We actually have a really specific mission for you today.
We do, and it's a massive one, honestly.
Yeah, we are going to completely upend basically everything you think you know about one of the most famous stories in human history.
Right.
I mean, we're talking about the exodus of Moses and the Israelites out of Egypt.
Exactly. And to do that, we're looking at a very specific, deeply fascinating source today.
Yeah, set the stage for us.
So we're looking at Lecture 8 out of a 14-part series by the mid-20th century Islamic scholar and philosopher Ghulam Ahmad Parwez.
Okay.
And we're focusing intensely on his analysis of Surah Ta-Ha, specifically verses 77 to 82 from the Quran.
Right. And our mission today is to essentially bypass all of that, that cinematic wizardry.
Put away the magic wand, basically.
Exactly. Because when you think about the ultimate Hollywood special effect, there's one specific scene that almost everyone can just visualize instantly.
Oh, absolutely. The parting of the Red Sea.
Right. You picture a rugged, bearded Moses. He's standing at the edge of the ocean, the wind is howling, and he lifts this heavy wooden staff high into the air.
And then the laws of physics just snap.
Yes, the ocean literally splits down the middle. You get these two massive, sheer, skyscraper-sized walls of frozen blue water.
Holding back millions of tons of pressure.
Like some kind of invisible glass dam. And the Israelites just, they walk through this dry canyon on the ocean floor like they're in a giant aquarium.
Pointing at the fish and everything.
Yeah, and then at the exact perfect dramatic second, the invisible dam breaks and the walls crash down on Pharaoh's screaming horses. It's the pinnacle of cinematic magic.
It is. It's totally ingrained in our collective consciousness.
Yeah.
But it also represents a really massive intellectual problem.
Well, so?
Well, the source material actually calls that specific imagery a cinematic prison.
A cinematic prison. That's a strong phrase.
It is, but it fits. Because when we get locked into that Cecil B. DeMille magic wand interpretation, it actively blinds us to what is actually happening in the texts.
Right, we get obsessed with the supernatural spectacle.
Exactly. And we completely miss the profound rationalist genius of what's being recorded. It reduces a very complex, brilliant socio-political revolution into a fairy tale.
I have to admit, calling it a cinematic prison feels a bit harsh, though. I mean, if you're raised with that story, the whole point is the spectacle, right?
That's the traditional view, yeah.
The spectacle is supposed to prove the divinity.
Yeah.
But, okay, if we are tossing out the magic wand today, I need you to prove it.
A challenge accepted.
Because the traditional telling doesn't leave a lot of ambiguity. God tells Moses to strike the sea with the staff hits the water parts. If it's not magic, what is it?
Let's start by looking directly at the original Arabic text in the Quran, specifically verse 77 of Surah Ta-Ha, because translation is exactly where the mythology creeps in.
Okay, lay it on me.
The instruction Moses receives contains the Arabic word asri. Now, asri does not mean, perform a miracle.
What does it mean?
It has a very specific, grounded definition. It means to plan a night march or to travel under the cover of darkness.
A night march.
Yeah. The text is immediately setting a tone of military strategy and covert operations.
Oh, wow. So he is planning the self-extraction of a massive population of enslaved people right under the nose of a superpower.
Exactly. But I know what you're going to say next.
Yeah, I'm going to say you can plan a night march all you want, but the text still mentions the staff. You can't just ignore the stick.
I wouldn't dream of it. The staff is central to understanding the linguistic brilliance here. This is where Parwez breaks down the classical Arabic idioms used in the verse.
Okay, I'm listening.
The phrase in question is darb fil ard. Now, if a literalist translates that word for word, it translates to striking the earth or hitting the ground.
Right, striking the ground with the staff.
But in classical Arabic and Persian idioms, darb fil ard does not mean physically hitting the dirt with a piece of wood. It means to travel, to journey, or to march aggressively.
Wait, really? So it's just an idiom?
Exactly.
Like if I tell someone to hit the road, I don't mean they should go outside and start punching the asphalt.
That is the perfect modern equivalent. Imagine a historian 3,000 years from now translating a text that says they hit the road to escape.
They'd think we had a weird road punching ritual.
Exactly. That's what has happened with darb fil ard. Striking the earth means your feet hitting the ground in a steady, determined march.
Okay, I see where you're going, but he still has the staff. Even if striking the earth means marching, why emphasize the staff?
Well, let's look at the Arabic word for staff used here, which is asa.
Asa. Okay.
While its literal meaning is a physical walking stick, in ancient Arabic sociological terms, asa is also widely used to denote a community, a group, or the cohesive bond of a people. Yeah, when a community was unified, they were referred to as a single asa. So when you combine these linguistic realities, Moses is not being told to magically beat the ocean.
So what's the command, rationally?
He is being commanded to take his
So
asa.
unified community.
Yes, and perform Darb Fillard, hit the road, march them out under the cover of the night march, the Isri.
Okay. Linguistically, I'm tracking with you. It changes the image from a wizard casting a spell to a general mobilizing his people.
Exactly.
But we still have a massive geographic problem here. You can march all night long, but eventually you hit water. If there's an ocean in front of you and an army behind you, you're going to get wet.
Which brings us to the next vital word in the verse, Yabasa. Moses is instructed to scout out a dry path.
A dry path.
Notice the pragmatism. This isn't an anti-gravity magic show. It is a directive to find an incredibly calculated tactical exploitation of real-world topography.
But hold on, where exactly are they? Because the Red Sea is massive. It's deep. There are no dry paths across the Red Sea.
Right, and that's the friction Parwez is highlighting. We have to look at a fascinating geographic and historical correction here. The body of water they crossed was likely never the Red Sea proper.
So the translation of Red Sea is just straight up wrong.
It's a historical mistranslation dating back to the Greek Septuagint. The accurate translation of the Hebrew term Yam Suf, which corresponds to the geographic area described here, is the Sea of Reeds.
The Sea of Reeds, not the Red Sea.
Right. This was a shallower, marshy tidal extension located at the northern tip of the Gulf of Suez.
A marshland, a tidal flat.
Yes.
That paints a completely different picture. We aren't talking about a sheer drop into the abyss anymore. We're talking about a volatile wetland.
Exactly. And now, factor in Moses' biography. He spent years living in exile in the wilderness of Midian as a shepherd.
Oh, right. So he knew the land.
Intimately, he knew the natural tidal, atmospheric, and seasonal cycles of this specific region infinitely better than the Egyptian commanders did.
Okay, the pieces are falling into place. If it's a tidal marshland, he knows about the tides.
Yeah.
He knows that at a certain time of year, or with certain extreme wind conditions, the water in this specific bottleneck recedes.
Parwez points out that Moses timed this Osri, this covert night march, to coincide perfectly with an extreme low tide, the ebb.
That is brilliant.
Combined with strong winds that physically push shallow water back, a phenomenon called a wind set down, the seabed was left exposed, firm, and dry enough to cross.
This completely shifts to the genre of this story. It's no longer a fantasy, it's geopolitical thriller.
It really is.
Think about the tension. You have a commander timing a massive extraction perfectly with, essentially, ancient tidal charts and meteorological knowledge.
Standing on the shore in the dark.
Thousands of terrified people looking to him, knowing the Egyptian chariots are closing in. And he just knows that at exactly a specific hour, the wind and tide will pull back.
And imagine the immense psychological discipline required from his people. To stare at a dark marsh and trust the path.
Wow. All right, so Moses and the Israelites hustle across this exposed tidal flat. They make it to the other side, but right behind them is Pharaoh.
Commanding the greatest military machine of the ancient world.
Which brings us to Ayat 79. The text simply says, "And Pharaoh misled his people and did not guide them."
Right.
Now, I have to be honest. When I read that before, my brain just glossed over it. I thought, yeah, Pharaoh's a bad guy. Generic villain stuff. It feels almost anticlimactic.
Which is exactly how most traditional commentaries treat it, just a generic moral failure.
But Parwez goes deeper.
He does. He redefines this completely using the concept of what we might call social physics. Pharaoh's failure wasn't just a lack of morality, it was a fatal misunderstanding of physical reality.
Okay, I really want to dig into that term, social physics. What does that mean for an ancient king standing on a muddy beach?
Let's examine the psychology of an absolute dictator. Pharaoh was considered a literal living god.
Right.
When you exist in an echo chamber where every command is instantly obeyed, you begin to genuinely believe your decrees override the laws of physics.
Ah, I see. If you say build a pyramid materializes. If you say divert the river, tens of thousands of laborers physically move the river.
You never hear the word no. Your brain gets wired to think the physical world obeys your voice.
That is terrifying.
It's the disease of absolute power. So here he is at the shores of the Sea of Reeds. Moses has crossed, but time has passed. The tide is turning. The water is surging back in.
Okay, and the source points out an incredibly vivid detail here, right? The horse sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
The idea that the horses actually understood the physics of the situation better than the human dictator.
How does that work exactly?
Animals are highly attuned to subtle environmental shifts. The horses likely smelled the shifting tide, felt the low tide mud flat turning soft beneath their hooves.
So they naturally resist going in.
Right. A horse has a preservation drive. It doesn't want to sink into mud. But the dictator lacks that instinct because his ego overrides his environment.
Pharaoh just ignores the environmental warning signs.
Completely. He whips the horses. He commands his heavy ironclad chariots with narrow wheels directly into a geographical trap.
He literally thought his political authority could hold back the ocean. He looked at the rising tide and thought, I am Pharaoh. The mud will not dare to trap me.
Exactly. It's a massive logistics check, and he fails because his political power blinded him to reality.
That is wild. Let's look at the Arabic word Parwez highlights for their drowning. Gashiyahum.
Yes, Gashiyahum. It translates to the water covered them or overwhelmed them. Parwez is adamant this returning water wasn't a vindictive lightning bolt from the sky.
It wasn't an emotional deity throwing a tantrum?
No, it was the natural fluid dynamic consequence of a tyrant ignoring physics. The heavy chariot wheels sink, the armored men cannot move, the tide comes in.
As the source quotes, time and tide wait for none, not even a pharaoh.
Exactly.
So let's bring this to you, the listener, right now. Why does this matter today? Think about how often modern leaders make the exact same catastrophic mistake.
All the time.
We see modern dictators, massive CEOs who surround themselves with yes men, and they start believing their wealth or influence can shield them from scientific realities.
They think they can legislate away a climate crisis.
Or ignore the math of a global pandemic. And what happens? The tide always comes back in. The laws of nature and economics do not care about your title.
That is the core rationalist lesson here. Moses succeeded because he aligned his actions with natural laws. Pharaoh was destroyed because his ego convinced him he was above them.
Okay, so the ocean claims Pharaoh. The Israelites are on the far shore, finally free. Now, in the movie version, this is where the music swells. Everyone weeps in prayer, and they have a massive religious festival.
Right, the big celebration scene.
But that is absolutely not what happens in the text, is it?
No, and the transition in the text is profoundly jarring. We move immediately to Ayat 80, the oppressor is gone, and the narrative instantly shifts away from the military victory and dives straight into, of all things, economic restructuring.
It goes straight from surviving a tidal flat to resource management. It's crazy. Verse 80 basically says, we saved you from your enemy, and we sent down to you manna and salwa.
We have to ask why the text pivots so sharply. Parwez argues it's entirely deliberate. The text doesn't celebrate a military victory with superstition because it's focused on building a civilization.
It addresses the rational baseline of freedom.
Because here's the harsh reality. You aren't truly free if you are starving. True freedom requires secure, unmonopolized resources.
Let's talk about that food supply, manna and salwa. This is another area where Sunday school stories do a massive disservice. People picture little plastic-wrapped loaves of bread gently parachuting down from the clouds.
Followed by perfectly roasted chickens on silver platters, right?
Exactly. It feeds into that passive, magical mindset.
It creates an image of a magical welfare state, which contradicts the Quran's emphasis on human effort. The source material grounds manna and salwa firmly in reality.
Break them down biologically for us.
Manna was not magical bread. It was a natural, sweet, highly nutritious resin or gum that exuded from desert bushes in the Sinai region, particularly the tamarisk tree.
Oh, like a sap?
Yes, it's a well-documented botanical phenomenon still harvested by Bedouins today. It appears as droplets, hardens in the cool desert night, and must be gathered early morning before the sun melts it.
So it provides dense carbohydrates. Essential energy. What about the salwa?
Salwa translates to quails, specifically the massive flocks of migratory quails common to the Mediterranean. By the time they fly over the sea and reach the Sinai shores, they are physically exhausted.
Oh, so they just land in the desert and they're easy to catch.
Exactly. Staggering numbers of them resting on the ground. A natural, abundant source of protein.
Okay, so carbs from the tamarisk resin, protein from the quail. But let me play devil's advocate. Why emphasize God providing these specific wild foods? Couldn't they just settle near an oasis and farm? Why a foraging diet?
To understand that, you have to look at the psychology of a liberated population. These people had been enslaved for generations. They were deeply institutionalized.
They're used to being provided for.
In Egypt, Pharaoh provided their rations. They had an ingrained psychological dependence on the welfare state of their masters. As a slave, you don't think about where your next meal comes from. The master decides it.
Right, you're just a cog. You get your daily allotment of onions and grain, and you have zero agency, but also zero responsibility for your own survival.
Precisely. So now they are out in the harsh wilderness. By directing them to manna and salwa, wild provisions they had to physically go out and gather themselves, the system forced them to interact with their environment as free people.
It broke their psychological dependence on a dictator.
Yes. They had to wake up, organize their families, gather the resin before it melted, hunt the quail. It was the first crucial step in rehabilitating the minds of a deeply traumatized population.
It's essentially wilderness therapy on a civilizational scale. You have to break the mind of a slave before you can build the mind of a citizen.
Well said.
But this provision comes with a very strict economic condition. And this brings us to Ayat 81. The text says, "Eat of the good things we have provided for you, but do not transgress therein."
The Arabic phrase for transgress there is Taha.
Right, Taha. Dissect this for us, because Parwez uses this to introduce the economic law of Tughyan, and it really seems like the linchpin of the whole lecture.
Tughyan is a fascinating and, frankly, terrifying concept applied to economics. The root of the word essentially means to cross the limits or to overflow boundaries.
Like becoming exorbitant.
In resource management, Tughyan means economic transgression. It means hoarding. It means individuals setting up monopolies over the manna and salwa, creating vast artificial economic inequality.
Parwez uses a really visceral metaphor here in the text. He compares Tughyan to a sailab, which is an Urdu and Persian word for a massive flood. How does hoarding equal a flood?
Well, think about the physics of water.
Yeah.
When a river flows steadily within its banks, it irrigates fields, it provides drinking water, it sustains civilization.
It gives life.
But what happens when the water crosses its natural limits? When it overflows or bursts a dam, it becomes a sailab, a devastating flood that destroys homes and kills the people it was meant to sustain.
And Parwez argues wealth and resources follow those exact same physics.
Yes, wealth circulating fairly sustains society. But the moment individuals hoard that wealth, creating artificial dams to stop the flow to the community, it builds unnatural pressure.
And eventually, that inequality becomes a destructive flood.
It destroys the social fabric, breeds resentment, leads to crime. That is Tughyan. The command is sustain yourselves, but do not hoard. Do not recreate the monopolistic inequality of the Egypt you just escaped.
And what happens if they do hoard? If they build storehouses of quail and charge their neighbors? The verse finishes with a severe warning. "Lest my anger descend upon you, and he upon whom my anger descends has certainly fallen."
The Arabic word for fallen there is hal.
Right. Now, I have to check my own bias here. When I hear divine anger, I immediately revert back to that cinematic mindset. I picture an emotional deity sitting on a cloud, getting personally offended, throwing a lightning bolt because somebody took an extra basket of quail.
It's a natural reaction based on how we've been conditioned, but Parwez translates this concept of divine anger into the harsh reality of social physics.
No, it's not an emotional outburst.
Not at all. It is the absolute, unavoidable structural law of cause and effect. Parwez calls it the law of requital.
So it's less like a judge banging a gavel and more like gravity. If you stick your hand into a roaring fire, you get burned. The fire isn't angry at you, it's just thermodynamics.
Exactly. And the same applies to sociology and economics. If a society builds its foundation on hoarding and extreme inequality, it will inevitably collapse under its own internal pressure. The anger is just the built-in consequence of the system failing.
And that brings us to the word used for this consequence, hawa. Parwez notes it doesn't just mean tripping over a rock.
No, the linguistics paint a terrifying picture. Hawa literally denotes falling from a very high mountain peak down into a deep abyss.
Like a boulder rolling off a cliff.
Exactly, gathering terminal velocity, unable to stop until it smashes at the bottom. The text is stating a socio-economic law. The moment a liberated society commits Tughyan, they enter a state of hawa. They push themselves off the civilizational cliff.
You can't cheat the system. Now, what makes this source material so compelling is that Parwez doesn't just leave this as an ancient history lesson. He applies this transition from Tughyan to hawa to modern historical movements.
He does.
And I want to be very clear with you listening. We are going to explore this historical analogy exactly as the source presents it. We are impartially reporting the geopolitical analysis found in Parwez's lecture. We aren't taking sides on 20th century politics. We are just looking at how the author uses modern history to prove a Quranic point.
Right, providing the context is vital. Parwez was writing and lecturing in the mid-20th century. He was deeply involved in the discourse surrounding the partition of India and the creation of Pakistan in 1947.
Okay.
In Lecture 8, he draws a direct, highly critical parallel between the exodus of the Israelites and the modern political struggle for the independence of Pakistan from the British Empire.
Let's walk through his analogy. In his framework, the British Empire represents the external pharaoh,
Yes.
and the Muslims of India, guided by the vision of Muhammad Iqbal and politically led by figures like Muhammad Ali Jinnah, they fought a fierce tactical battle to secure an independent homeland.
They marched out of their own metaphorical Egypt, they crossed their own Sea of Reeds.
And they succeeded in escaping the physical borders of the empire. But Parwez argues that achieving independence was only crossing the water. It was the easy part.
The true existential test came on the other side, in the desert of nation building. What economic system would they implement?
According to Parwez, Iqbal and Jinnah envisioned a new state built strictly on what he calls the Quranic constitution, an equitable system devoid of economic exploitation and feudalism.
But the source argues that almost immediately after independence was secured, that equitable vision was abandoned. Parwez is highly critical of the political leadership and the religious clergy of the time.
Right, he specifically mentions groups like the Jamaat-e-Islami and figures like Abu al-Maududi. He notes Maududi originally opposed the creation of Pakistan, but later moved there and attempted to claim its ideological direction.
The overarching critique Parwez is making is that the new nation fundamentally failed the Ayat 81 test.
So instead of establishing that baseline of Manna and Salwa where resources are shared, they fell back into Tughyan.
They allowed the oppressive British-era feudalism to persist. They fell into capitalist hoarding, allowing deep economic inequality to take root. They allowed sectarianism to divide the community.
They idolized the pursuit of political power rather than implementing a fair distribution of resources.
Exactly. And if they committed Tughyan, the law of requital dictates they enter the state of Hawa. Parwez is essentially standing in front of his audience, warning them that because they successfully escaped the British, but replicated the exact same exploitative economic systems, they were actively pushing their brand new civilization off a mountain peak.
That is a devastating synthesis of his argument. Geography does not save you.
No, it doesn't.
You can march out of Egypt, watch the dictator drown, but if you pack up the dictator's economic system in your bags and plant it in your new homeland, your civilization will still hit the ground and shatter. Gravity works exactly the same on the far shore.
The law of requital is utterly impartial.
Man, that is a heavy realization to sit with. You can change the flag, change the national anthem, but if you replicate the tyrant's systems of inequality, you haven't actually escaped it all. You've just changed management.
And that profound realization brings us to the most dangerous, unstable part of any revolution or liberation movement.
Which is what?
The external tyrant is dead, drowned in the mud. But the hardest part of a revolution isn't escaping the dictator. It's escaping the enslaved mindset left inside your own people.
Wow.
The physical iron chains are gone, but the mental chains, the desire for a master to provide for you, the urge to hoard resources out of fear, those chains are still tightly secured around their minds.
And the terrifying truth is that those mental chains are comfortable. True freedom requires immense daily personal responsibility. You can't just blame Pharaoh anymore.
Exactly.
Which brings us back to the shores of the Sea of Reeds. We have covered immense ground today. We've watched Moses execute a physically impossible-seeming escape through pure geographic brilliance, fluid dynamics, and logistical timing.
We've seen him lay down the immediate foundational rules of a fair anti-monopoly economy, knowing that without it, his people would destroy themselves.
But the story of this revolution is far from over.
Far from it. Because the moment Moses steps away, literally, he leaves the camp and goes up the mountain to finalize this institutional constitution, a massive power vacuum opens up.
Oh boy.
And an old capitalist collaborator steps out of the crowd. This individual sees that the people are deeply terrified of their new freedom. He sees their psychological insecurities, their longing for the tangible structures of Egypt, and he knows exactly how to exploit them.
Okay, this is the teaser for the next part of the source, isn't it? Yes. I can feel the cliffhanger coming.
It absolutely is. In Lecture 9 out of 14, covering the next sequence in Surah Ta-Ha verses 83 to 95, We are going to meet a character named Samiri.
Samiri.
Yes, and we will watch him step into that leadership vacuum and physically manufacture a golden, tangible, economic idol. A shiny, comfortable system of exploitation that threatens to completely derail the entire revolution before it even gets off the ground.
Oh, that is fascinating.
It is a masterclass in how easily a liberated people can be tricked into rebuilding their own prison. You really will not want to miss the next deep dive.
I am already hooked. We went from the cinematic illusion of skyscraper walls of water to the gritty, high-stakes reality of title charts, social physics, and building a fair economy from scratch. It changes everything about how you read this text.
It really does flip the script.
So as you go about your day, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on what we've unpacked today. Look around at your own life, your own daily routines, and your own society. Ask yourself, are the systems of comfort in your life the massive conveniences you rely on so you don't have to think too hard or take too much responsibility for your own survival? Are they actually subtle forms of enslavement?
A great question.
Are you standing on the shore of your own freedom, secretly wishing you could go back to the predictable, guaranteed rations of Egypt? Think about it. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.